Hello everyone, and welcome to session 2 of Protecting Our Future. This session is on Indigenous cultures and restorative justice. Indigenous cultures are present throughout the world. There are many different Indigenous communities, and each one has a unique story to tell. But there are some similarities, mostly it has to be said, unfortunately, negative similarities that require our attention. The restorative justice element is the fact that many of these communities and people who support these communities are calling for some sort of redress to the injustices that they've had to suffer in the past, and to do something to restore the negative legacy that has been left, where these communities find themselves very disadvantaged and suffering greatly as a result of their past history. There are many different Indigenous groups throughout the world, and obviously every story is unique. But one thing that most of them have in common is that they're struggling to preserve their culture, they're struggling to preserve their land or to reclaim their land. They are often on the wrong side of decision making about development, and they often find it very difficult to transmit their culture from generation to generation because of all the difficulties that they face. Indigenous communities are amongst the poorest people in the world. They constitute 5% of the world's population, but 15% of the extreme poor, and even more disturbingly, 1/3 of rural poor. And many suffer not just from physical deprivation, but also poor mental health. In Canada, for example, Indigenous people die by suicide at a rate 3 times as high as non-Indigenous Canadians. And this is in a country that is a wealthy country, a country with a good health system, with good social welfare, and with a good legal system. A country that actually has the resources to ensure that this doesn't happen, but yet it is suffering these very terrible conditions. And as we have seen a lot in the media recently, there is increasing evidence that Indigenous children were maltreated in boarding schools, and this has caused a great deal of trauma and upset, and also a lack of confidence in the government. So why are we in this situation of Indigenous communities being treated like this? Well, the origins of many issues today can be traced to the colonial period, when Indigenous people were often killed, they were moved off their land, and they were subjected to forced assimilation by colonial settlers. As European colonization spread over the whole world, there in the end were very few places in the world untouched by this process. But in many places, the colonizers were in the minority, and the local population remained the majority population. This population was often treated very badly and discriminatory, but they did not lose their identity because they were in the majority. What I want to focus on in this particular presentation is countries where white settlers emigrated en masse, where the country they emigrated to had a very low density population, and thus they became the overwhelming majority, and they had no room for Indigenous culture in their vision of how the country was to develop, because their intention was to create a new Europe. And today, these countries are the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Now, every Indigenous community has a unique story to tell. And there's a narrative that is special to that place. Obviously, in a short presentation, one can't cover everything. But what I would like to do in this particular presentation is to look at the situation in this kind of community where the white settlers have become the dominant culture, and how the injustices that have occurred as a result of that, but more particularly what we can do today to try and put this right and make for a better future. Now, globally, I'm sure that most people would have heard most about the situation in the United States, because the popular culture of the United States has spread all over the world, and because for quite a long time, up until the second half of the 20th century, a key figure in that American popular culture were the people who were seen as pioneering heroes who pushed westward, the white settlers who pushed westward and forced out the American Indians and created the United States as we have it today. I think nowadays we have a lot more recognition of the injustices that were caused at that time, of the terrible plight of the American Indians, of how they suffered violence, of how they were made to leave their traditional lands. And they were often compelled to move to tribal reservations. The land that was given to them was inferior land that was very often not well suited to their culture and how they had lived their lives. And it was also often quite isolated. Many gravitated to the cities. The cities did not necessarily offer them that much better a life, as they often ended up in the more deprived areas of the cities. Also, for many of them, it was very hard to keep their tribal identity because there were many different American Indian groups in the cities. But there was one advantage to this, in that they were able to join together to form the American Indian movement. And as such, they could join in the civil rights protests of the period. This was a period during the 1960s, 1970s, where different disadvantaged groups were campaigning to get a fairer deal from society. African Americans, women and other groups were fighting to be treated equally. And American Indians joined in those protests. And they were eventually successful in getting past a very significant piece of legislation that is called NAGPRA. And NAGPRA stands for the North American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which was passed in 1990. And this protected the rights of federally recognized tribes on federal land or in development projects using federal money. This is a reburial ceremony, and this is one of the most notable aspects of NAGPRA that we see, their right to demand back the human remains and burial objects that are in museums. NAGPRA, when it was first passed in 1990, was it was quite conflictual. Archaeologists and anthropologists had never before had to negotiate with American Indians whose heritage they were excavating and were recording. And not everyone really accepted this at the beginning. So in the 1990s and maybe the first decade of the 21st century, there were a lot of arguments, there were lawsuits. It was not necessarily a very smooth relationship. I think that we can say now that we're in 2023 that things have moved on. Now it's now 30 years since NAGPRA was passed. So people who work in the field today, they have grown up with NAGPRA. They understand it, accept it a lot more. It's not to say that NAGPRA is by any means perfect. There are many aspects of it that are quite difficult to enforce, and it's incomplete. But nevertheless, in 1990, it was an extremely important step forward, and it also became significant to other Indigenous peoples around the world who understood that they could get legislation passed that would make a significant difference. I think it raised confidence a lot. What I would like to do now is to move on to look at Australia. Now, Australia is probably, in global terms, not as well known in its Indigenous issues as North America. But it is an extremely interesting story. It's a story that's been moving fast in the last few years. Well, I say fast, that's in relative terms. It takes a long time to do anything in this field, but there has been significant progress, and I think it's shown some lessons that we can learn in and put to practice in other situations. Now, I want to emphasize once again that every Indigenous community is unique and every situation is unique. But I think there are certain questions that come up again and again, and we can learn from other people, and this can influence our decision making. So I would like to take the next few moments to talk more extensively about Australia and its path to arriving at where it is at the moment. So Australia was landed upon by British colonists in 1770, and it was declared terra nullius. That is, an empty land with no inhabitants. So it was not believed that the Aboriginal people were actually to be regarded as people who could own land. They were not regarded as people who had title to that land. And for the first 100 years of its existence, Australia was used by Britain as a penal colony. It sent its convicts there. Also, other colonists moved there, but I think we have to imagine that anyone who was prepared to sail off to literally the other side of the world to a country that had not really been developed was probably someone who did not have a great situation back in Britain. And Britain was the largest colonizer of Australia. I think you would have to be in a pretty desperate state to think that your life would be better by going to Australia. So I think there were many reasons why the early population of Australia was one that was quite a rough situation that was quite tough to survive in. And certainly they treated the Aboriginal population very violently. And by 1901 had developed a policy that the best thing to do was to eliminate them. Now, at the end of the 19th century, Australia becomes independent from Britain. And in 1900, the Commonwealth of Australia Act is passed, which makes it into a new country, essentially. It's called a Commonwealth because there were previously 6 independent states, so it's becomes like a federal situation. And almost immediately, one of their first policies they pass is the White Australia policy, which is the idea that this new nation is going to be restricted to immigration for white people. In particular, they wanted to stop Asian immigration. White Australia was a remarkably long-lived policy, in fact, up until 1966, but it was not completely dismantled till 1973. And racial discrimination was not outlawed until 1975. So it had a really long life as a policy. Now, I guess it is to be expected that as they did not want white immigrants, they similarly did not want Aboriginals. And as in North America, the initial way of controlling the Aboriginal population was to move them onto tribal reserves, which controlled their lives. But in 1937, this policy gave way to assimilation into the white population. And this is taken from the government document that authorises this. It believes the ultimate destiny of the natives lies in their ultimate absorption by the people of the Commonwealth. And the policy of the Commonwealth is to do everything possible to convert and here they use a racially offensive term, into a white citizen. Now, shutting down the reserves and taking people out of the reserves is not in itself a philanthropic act. And it wasn't in other countries either, because what ends up happening is that they go to towns and cities and they end up living on the edges of those towns, often in poverty, well, nearly always in poverty, in fact. And it doesn't bring about assimilation. But the Australian government had another way of bringing about assimilation, which has become known as the stolen generations. Here, Aboriginal children were taken from their parents and given for adoption or placed in institutes. And here they were forced to reject Aboriginal culture and assimilate to white culture. And the parents had no say in it. They were forcibly taken or often kind of tricked into giving up their children. The names were changed. They were forbidden to speak their traditional languages. And in this way, the government believed that the Aborigines would just die out eventually. But it had an incredibly traumatic effect on those people. This woman is campaigning outside the Parliament building, and very poignantly she says, "Kidnapped from happiness, a mum and dad we never knew." And the legacy of this policy has reverberated down through the generations, and it is still really present today, because the stolen generation themselves were obviously very traumatized, And this very much impacted also on their ability to be parents. Here is a picture of the Aboriginal flag, which is a great unifying symbol for Aborigines. In 1976, there was the Aboriginal Land Act, which gave the Aborigines some sort of control over the land. Very importantly, in 1992, terra nullius was declared invalid, which had very significant impact on the ability of Aborigines to have title to land. And in 1998, the motion of reconciliation was passed. But by far the most important step forward was in 2008, when the Prime Minister issued a public apology to stolen generations. This is Kevin Rudd. This is quite a long clip, so I'm not going to play it all. I'm going to play just the first part of it to show you how important this was to the Aboriginal population of Australia.
The word historic is overused.
The word historic is overused, but not on this occasion. We've seen history made today with Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, backed by the opposition, determined to make the sorry motion a springboard for an all-out effort to improve health, housing and education in Indigenous communities.
It was a long time coming, but at last
the Prime Minister uttered the words Indigenous Australia has been waiting for.
For the pain, hurt, suffering and hurt of these stolen generations,
their descendants and for their families left behind.
Kevin Rudd's apology broke what he called
Parliament's stony, stubborn and deafening silence on a dark chapter in Australia's history. The forcible removal of up to 50,000 children from their Aboriginal families during the first 75 years of Federation. Mr Rudd did not say sorry just once, he used the word repeatedly.
As Prime Minister of Australia, I am sorry.
On behalf of the Government of Australia.
On behalf of the Government of Australia.
Indigenous people, including many members of the
stolen generations, packed the House of Representatives galleries to hear the Prime Minister move a resolution that he said would remove a great stain from the nation's soul. People wept as Mr Rudd spoke.
The hurt, the humiliation, and the sheer brutality of the act of physically separating a mother from her children is a deep assault on our senses. On our most elemental humanity.
Aboriginal Australians began queuing at the doors of Parliament House soon after dawn to witness what they clearly saw as a momentous event. Before Parliament convened, Mr Rudd stood in a courtyard greeting 100 Aboriginal guests, overwhelmingly stolen generation members, brought to Canberra by the government.
We just trying to do the right thing.
4 of the 5 former Prime Ministers still living were in the chamber to mark the occasion. Only John Howard stayed away. In his speech, Mr Rudd called on fellow MPs to seize the day and make the apology a turning point.
The nation is calling on us, the politicians, to move beyond our infantile bickering.
He proposed a joint policy commission co-chaired by himself and opposition leader Brendan Nelson to develop an effective housing strategy for remote Aboriginal communities and then work out how to recognise the first Australians in the Constitution. Dr Nelson agreed immediately. As the two leaders shook hands in a display of bipartisanship, there were unprecedented scenes, the crowd in the galleries standing to clap and cheer. Clearly emotional Mr Rudd applauding them in turn. The opposition leader supported the motion and acknowledged that children were scarred by removal from family.
But some of Dr Nelson's comments angered many in the Indigenous audience.
It's reasonably argued that removal from squalor led to better lives.
Those watching his speech on a big screen in Parliament's Great Hall turned their backs and sought to drown out his words with loud hand claps. later, Mr Rudd was embarrassed when it was revealed that his press secretary, Lachlan Harris, and another staffer who were in the Great Hall also turned their backs during the opposition leader's speech.
I wrote a letter of apology to Mr Nelson.
A handful of Liberals boycotted the vote, but with all MPs in the chamber rising to indicate support, the sorry motion was deemed to pass unanimously. Laurie Oakes, National 9
was delivered, as the apology was delivered, emotions ran wild here with people crying, others clapping, and many simply embracing each other. It was truly touching, with everyone feeling here that they had been part of something special, and that today spells a new start in the journey towards reconciliation and new hope for the future.
We say sorry. We say sorry.
It was one small word.
It was one small word, but it triggered an emotional response.
As soon as Kevin Rudd uttered the word sorry, the tears started flowing.
As Prime Minister of Australia, I am sorry. On behalf of the government of Australia,
A crowd of more than 2,000 people gathered on the lawns outside Parliament for the history-making apology. They'd come from all over the country, black and white Australians, families, school groups, pensioners, and many with painful stories were forced removed.
We lived all those policies, and I enjoyed the fact that he said that it came from the Parliament.
It made me very sad. My father was taken away in 1913. He was taken away in 1913, and we had to live with that.
So moving on now from Australia, but we're going to come back to Australia at the end because there's actually another chapter to that story. But I think it's really what that shows was really how important just something as simple as saying sorry can be, and how transforming that can be for a community. But what I want to look at now is what's happening in the international community. Shouldn't we have some sort of international support for Indigenous peoples throughout the world? I mean, they're so ubiquitous throughout the world. Surely we should also be looking to our international organisations to give them support. And in particular, what's been happening in UNESCO, because UNESCO is the United Nations agency that is specifically tasked with looking after the world's heritage. So how has UNESCO been helping Indigenous communities? Well, if we look back at the beginning of UNESCO in 1945, we can see that really helping Indigenous communities should have been, part of its agenda right from the beginning. It's got such lofty ambitions to contribute to the building of peace, the eradication of poverty, sustainable development, intercultural dialogue. Helping Indigenous communities surely is something that should have been high on their agenda, but it has to be said that initially it was not. Initially, the focus of UNESCO was very much on monumental cultural heritage, on large buildings, on the kind of elite buildings that are very embedded in Western culture, often on buildings that are kind of part of a national identity. And they really didn't seem to have a great deal of focus on other types of heritage. A very significant development in UNESCO was the Aswan Dam project in Egypt. UNESCO's involvement in this began in about 1960. The Aswan Dam is this huge dam. Here you can see it from Google Earth and see just how big it is. And it was very much needed in Egypt. It produced 50% of Egypt's electricity. Many people got electricity for the first time. Controlled the flooding and made the Nile more navigable. Later on, there were actually found to be less desirable environmental consequences, but definitely when it began, it really was seen as a significant development. But it came at a high cost because the area it flooded was an area of pharaonic monuments, an area that was full of archaeological sites, big temples, which would have to be sacrificed to make this hydroelectric project work. In dealing with this, all of these sites that were flooded had to be recorded, and some of the most important ones were dismantled and reconstructed elsewhere, including the Temple of Ramses II. This was an extraordinary undertaking. Nothing like this had ever been attempted before. And in order to do it, it required an international team. It would have been quite beyond the resources of any one country to do it. And this international team stretched right across geopolitical divides. At this time, the world was really divided by the Cold War. And there were teams from both sides of the Cold War that came in to help with this project. And it was called the founding narrative of UNESCO. That is, that it was a project that was that was seen as being so significant for the world in general that everybody was capable of coming together to work on it. And UNESCO deemed it to be a complete and spectacular success. What was not advertised at the time was all of the people who got displaced as a result of the Aswan Dam, and in particular a large community of Nubian population who lost their land. the land that they were given as alternative was actually not suitable for their culture. Many of them left and they gravitated to cities where they lived on the edges of cities, usually in poverty. They did not get the recompense that they had been promised, and the dislocation caused them to lose much of their intangible cultural heritage, including a lot of the language. The indigenous population was completely invisible in the Aswan Dam project of UNESCO. So at that time, there really was no focus on living heritage and on preserving the kind of intangible cultural heritage that is so important to any community. And it really took until the end of the 20th century before UNESCO became really visible in actively supporting indigenous communities. One of the first acts that they did was in 2003 in this regard, was to pass the Convention for the Safeguarding of Intangible Cultural Heritage, which means all of the rituals and customs, belief systems, oral histories, dance, costume, everything that's really not encapsulated in something like art or architecture. And although this is not specifically aimed at indigenous peoples, it's because everybody's got intangible cultural heritage, it is particularly important to them, as often intangible cultural heritage is the means through which they transmit their culture and their values. Most indigenous communities have less in the way of big monumental buildings. But this convention puts these customs on a level, regarded as being the same in terms of their heritage value as cathedrals, palaces, castles. So it was really significant for indigenous communities. This is the first element on the list, which is a square in the centre of Marrakesh, where crafts are carried out and traditional practices such as henna tattoos and different forms of sort of snake charming and things like that. In 2007, finally, there is a declaration on the rights of indigenous peoples, but I want you to note that this is a declaration, not a convention. Even a convention is not as powerful as many people think it is. It isn't a law. It doesn't become law until a country ratifies it and passes it through its own legislature. And a declaration is much less than that even. A declaration is just a statement, really. But it is a statement that can raise the profile and can have an impact. And this one certainly did. It said, Indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination. They have the right to self-government and a right to their own culture. And it was passed by the General Assembly in 2007 with 144 states in favour. But the 4 states who were against it were actually the ones who were most affected by it: United States, Canada, Australia and New Zealand. And one can see why they might not be in favour of it, because it was declaring that some parts of their population should be given self-government, which is quite a big step for any nation to agree to. So I guess it's not that surprising that in 2007 they were not in favour of this. Ultimately, all 4 countries reversed that decision, but stress that it is aspirational, not legally binding. So it's a question of inching towards self-government, which in actual fact they are doing in a certain way, or at least a greater recognition of involvement in government. And as I promised before, we're going to come back to Australia to see the latest in its story of coming to some accord with its Indigenous people. Because it's going to hold in 2023, it's going to hold a referendum to change the constitution to allow in Parliament an Indigenous voice. So that is a specific Indigenous representation in Parliament. Now, obviously, this is going to take some time to do this. It is firstly just the referendum, then it will all have to be drawn up and passed through Parliament, and then we'll have to see how it actually gets enacted. But it is progress. But one of the things that I think we can see from the case studies we looked at is that progress does look slow. It always is, but it doesn't mean it's not happening. But it does take a long time for this to happen, because there's a lot that has to be changed in order to undo some of the context that allowed for this situation to arise. It is not very easy to unravel it. Well, that is the end of this presentation. I want to stress again that every Indigenous community is unique. It has its own unique story, that it should tell itself, that the intention of this presentation is just to give a short introduction to spark interest and for us to explore ways that we can move forward on this and aim for a world in which Indigenous groups do not feel so threatened by other groups. Thank you for listening.